And so another day passed. And when that day was done, Scheherazade and the king retired to the royal bedroom. And when the moment was right, Dunyazad, Scheherazade's sister, was sent for, and she came and the two sisters embraced. And then Dunyazad said, "O my sister, if you are not sleepy, please tell us the rest of the story of the one-eyed Sufi dervish who was transformed into a gorilla." "Yes, yes," said the king. "Please tell us the rest of that story." And so Scheherazade said, "It has reached my ears, O king, that the Sufi dervish went on with his story, and said, 'So the sailors looked at me, and they all wanted to kill me, for they thought they would come to rescue a castaway from some ship, but instead they'd found me, a gorilla, there on the shore. So I heard their threats against my life, how they wanted to strangle me or drown me or kill me with a sword, and when they said these things, I reached out and I cugged the knees of the captain, and tears fell trickling down my face, my hairy gorilla face. And the sea captain said, 'My sailors, clearly this gorilla has thrown himself upon my mercy. Clearly he is a supplicant looking for compassion from the world. So I will give him this compassion. He may ride with us on our expedition.' So I boarded that ship, and we left that coast and sailed across the sea. And I could not speak, of course, but I understood everything the sailors or the captain said, so I tried to help them as best I could. And they marveled at my expertise, it seemed, and my ability, it seemed, to anticipate what they were saying, they thought, but in fact I understood every word they said. So we traveled for 50 days across the sea. And finally we came to a harbor of a populous and beautiful city in a distant kingdom where I had never been. And when we docked there on the shore, a messenger came to us from the king of that realm, and he had a scroll of paper in his hand. And he said, 'Welcome, travelers, welcome, merchants and sailors, from your long voyage. I congratulate you on arriving home safe and sound. And also I bring news, for the king's vizier has died, and he is seeking a new vizier. And as you know, the old vizier had exquisite knowledge of all the calligraphies of this world. He knew poetry, he knew philosophy, he was an eloquent and cultured man. And so the king is seeking a new vizier by having many people in his kingdom, whoever can write down on this scroll a line or two of poetry or whatever words they can muster. And then he will look these over and choose the most elegant hand, and he will make that person his vizier. So please, if any of you can write on this scroll something, and then the king will take a look at it later.' So a few of the merchants took a quill, and they began writing on this scroll. And I saw their handwriting, and it was atrocious, I must tell you. It was abominable. And I started to jump up and down. I started to roar a little bit and grunt. And they all looked at me like, 'What's wrong with the gorilla? What's wrong with the gorilla?' And then another merchant took a quill and he wrote some more on the scroll. And I jumped up and down and I waved my hands around trying to mimic the gestures of writing something on a scroll. They looked at me and they said, 'I think the gorilla wants to write. That's crazy.' And they all laughed. Gales of laughter shook the boat. And still one more merchant wrote his hand. He tried his hand at that scroll and wrote a few lines of poetry, terrible poetry. So finally I ran over there and I grabbed the quill. And everybody was aghast and they were in shock. But then I went to the scroll and I began to write. And I wrote, in the Kufic script, I wrote, 'Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though.' And then in the Ruka script I wrote, 'I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze.' And then in the Raihani script I wrote, 'Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient ether eyes upon a table.' And then in the Naski script I wrote, 'Tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?' And then in the Thuluth script I wrote, 'How strange to think of giving up all ambition. Suddenly I see so clearly the flake of snow on the horse's mane.' And then in the Tumar script I wrote, 'The strong leaves of the box elder tree, plunging in the wind, Call us to disappear into the wilds of the universe, where we shall sit at the foot of a plant and live forever like the dust. And then in my own hand I wrote, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So I wrote these poems on the scroll, and then the messenger took it back to the king. And I heard later that he took that to the king in the throne room there, a beautiful throne room with a rose window behind the throne, and a fountain there in the courtyard there. And the king looked at this scroll and saw the samples of handwriting and calligraphy by all the people, the merchants, the learned people of that realm, who all sought to be the vizier. And he looked them all over, and he picked finally the lines that I had written. He chose the very words I had written on that scroll, and he said, Whoever wrote these has a firm and an elegant hand. I believe that this man shall be my vizier. Find him, bring him a donkey, get him on that donkey, and give him a robe of honor, and parade him through the streets back to this palace. And when he said this, many of his men there began to laugh and to snicker. And the king said, What's so funny? And they said, Sire, forgive us, your majesty. But the man who wrote those words is in fact not a man at all, but a gorilla. A gorilla, said the king. Yes, indeed, he's a gorilla that just came in on a ship. A bunch of merchants came across the sea, and they brought a gorilla with them that they found in a far and distant land. And he writes with an amazing hand. He writes calligraphy in all the different styles and modes. It's quite extraordinary. Well, bring him here, said the king, and bring the donkey and the robe of honor to him. Clearly, he must be the most cultured and intelligent gorilla this world has ever seen. So, as I was sitting there on the boat, they came. They came with a donkey and a robe of honor, the king's men. They put this robe of honor over me. It was green and gold, and they set me on that donkey, and they began to parade me from that boat to the king's palace. Through the streets I went, and people threw flowers, and they sang songs, and all the people of that kingdom came out of their houses, leaning out of windows and doorways to see this gorilla, this amazing gorilla who was going to see the king. People were amazed. So I went through the city streets. People stopped what they were doing to stare at me on this donkey with all the flowers at my feet and the robe of honor around my shoulders. And finally, there was a blowing of trumpets, and I came to the royal palace itself. And guards took me. I got off that donkey, and they took me through the many hallways of that palace, all the beautiful corridors of that fantastic place, until finally I came to the throne room. A beautiful room, as I have said, with a fountain there with burbling water in it, and behind the throne there was a rose window of glass behind in the wall right there. And the king looked at me and welcomed me to that room. And he asked me if I would eat, and I grunted, and then we sat down at a table, and we began to eat together. And I was sure to wash my hands 7 times and say my prayers before we ate, as all civilized, cultured people do. And then I ate with the king, and I was sure not to eat too much. And then I saw that there was a chessboard not far off on a table, a stone table right there, beside a bowl filled with pomegranates. And I motioned to the chessboard as if I wanted to play. And the king said, You play? And so we sat down, and the king and I played a game of chess. And the first game was a draw, but the second game I won, and the third game I won as well. And all his servants and hangers-on, they all marveled. They were amazed to see the king playing chess with a gorilla. So we played chess for a while, and when that was finished, the king said to one of his servants, Fetch my daughter. She must come see this. This is a marvel. This is an amazing thing which is happening here. And so a servant went away and fetched the king's daughter, and she was summoned to the throne room there. And she came in wearing a beautiful scarlet dress, and she came into that room, and she said, Father, why are you displaying me before this young man? And he said, "Young man, what young man do you mean? There's just me here and the gorilla." And she said, "That is no gorilla, father. No, no, that's a young man. He is under a spell. I can see that quite clearly." "How do you know this?" he said. "Father, I have been studying with a woman of power in the forest. Yes, from a young age I have been studying with this woman of power in the wilderness there, and I have learned many things from her. I have learned the rhythms of the seasons and the magic that is inside all things. The thread that binds this world together, I have seen that very thread. I have learned to speak the magic words that makes communion happen between the raindrops and the dirt, that makes the wind stop in its tracks and consider what it is doing. I have learned to read dreams and see the secret movements of this world. I have learned second sight, and I look at that gorilla there and I can see clearly that's no gorilla. That's a young man. He was put under a spell by an evil genie. A genie who, let's see now, yes, I can see quite clearly. A genie who was keeping his wife in a room below the forest floor, far away. And this poor man, stumbled into that room and was caught by the genie and transported to a mountain and turned into a gorilla. And now here he is in our throne room." "That's amazing," said the king. "Well, can you cure him in some way? Can you break this spell?" And she said, "There is nothing I would be happier to do. For clearly he is a cultured and intelligent man. We must liberate him from his gorilla form here and make him human once again." "Well, then do this," said the king. So the king's daughter went to the middle of the throne room, and she took a vial from her pocket, and there was red sand in that vial, and she scattered it on the floor, and with her hands she smoothed it out, and then with her finger she made a big circle there, and inside that circle she traced all kinds of complicated patterns, and she wrote words in Hebrew, in Sanskrit, and in various forms of Arabic, and strange diagrams were there on the floor. And then when they were all there displayed in this red sand on the floor of the throne room, she said some magic words. She said, and she stepped back. And suddenly there was a rumbling sound, and suddenly with a great flash of lightning, the rose window of that throne room shattered, and into that room there jumped a lion with huge golden wings on his back. And he sprawled in the middle of the throne room, and he looked at the daughter of the king, and he said, "So you have broken our agreement, have you?" And she said, "Yes, I have, for why should I keep an agreement with one such as you?" "Well, then, come get your reward," said the lion, and he leapt into the air, a huge, fantastic leap across the room. But as he leapt, the king's daughter pulled a hair from her head. She said a magic word over it, and that hair blossomed and shone and became a mighty, sparkling scimitar, a sharp sword. And she raised that sword high, and she brought it down and cut off the head of that lion, and it rolled away across the floor. And as it rolled, it became more crackly and drier, and suddenly it became a huge, hissing scorpion. And this scorpion leered up off the floor and came crawling across the floor towards her. But as it did, she turned herself into a snake, a gigantic snake. And she wrapped herself around that scorpion, and the two fought a pitched battle for many minutes this way and that across the throne room. We all scattered to the edges of the room. The pomegranates in the bowl were scattered in all directions. The stone table went flying one way and then the other way. They were beating each other, thrashing the scorpion, trying to sting the snake, but failing over and over again. And finally, the scorpion turned itself into a vulture and flapped up into the ceiling of the room. And the snake transformed itself into an eagle and followed, and the two of them went out a window high into the sky. We heard them shrieking and crying in the sky above the palace. And we all looked at each other with astonishment, and we wiped our faces. We were amazed, and we were glad. We breathed a sigh of relief. "That's over," we said. "That's over." But then suddenly the ground cracked open in the throne room. There was a huge crack, and stones fell down into it, and out came a screeching bobcat. And behind that bobcat was a black wolf, and they chased each other around the throne room in circles this way and that way. And finally the bobcat leapt into the air towards one of the pomegranates on the floor. And in mid-air the bobcat began to shrivel and get very small, like a cat, then like a mouse, then like a tiny worm, and then it was a worm, and it dove down into that pomegranate and burrowed into that pomegranate. And we all watched as suddenly the pomegranate began to shiver and move this way and that way and twitch, and it got bigger and bigger. Pretty soon it was like a large melon. Pretty soon it was like a watermelon. It was huge, and then it exploded, and there were pomegranate seeds all over the floor and in the fountain as well. And as we watched, the black wolf transformed itself into a rooster, and the rooster began to peck and eat all of the pomegranate seeds on the floor of that throne room. all of them, and they vanished one by one into the gullet of this rooster. And then finally the rooster looked around, squawking in some distress, and we looked around as well. Wait, there was one tiny seed jammed into the corner of the fountain. The rooster was not seeing it. I pointed to show the rooster the seed, but it was too late, and the seed fell into the water of the fountain itself and became a salmon and began to whirl around inside that water. And the rooster leapt into the water there and became a great trout, and they followed each other this way and that, frothing in the water. And then suddenly the water began to bubble and boil, and two great balls of fire came out of that fountain, a green ball of fire and a blue ball of fire, and they clashed and snapped and crackled in the air. The air was filled with strange bolts of lightning. They went this way, that way, they bounced around that room, and suddenly one of the balls of fire hit the right side of my face, and I was blinded, and that is the moment in which I lost my right eye. And then, after that, the other ball of fire hit the side of the king's face, and he was horribly burned all down the side of his face. And then they whirled around this way and that, around and round, and suddenly there was a great crackling, thunderous sound, and the blue ball of fire became a heap of ashes on the floor of that throne room. And the green ball of fire transformed itself into the king's daughter. She was lying on her side beside the fountain. She was breathing heavily, and she said, "That was a tough battle, and I have been victorious. But I have been poisoned by the magic of this genie, and I do not have long to live. Father, father, fetch me a bowl of water." And the king went to the fountain. He got a bowl of water. He brought it to his daughter, and she grabbed hold of that bowl, and with shaking hands, she whirled the water around on her fingers, and she came to me, and she sprinkled me with that water, and she spoke magic words in Arabic and in Hebrew and in languages I did not understand. And as she did so, the hair of my body began to evaporate, and suddenly I looked out, and I was no longer a gorilla, but I was a man. I was a man again. I had hands, feet, and knees. I was human once again. I wept for joy, but through my tears I saw the king's daughter, and I saw her shake and tremble, and she said, "Goodbye, father. I love you dearly. I love you dearly. There is no God but Allah in the high heavens above." And then as she said these words, she became a heap of ashes as well. Now the king screamed and raged. He cried. He was distraught. He was horribly distraught, and he mourned his dear daughter for many days. But when that mourning was through, the king had a great vaulted mausoleum built over her ashes. But the ashes of the genie, the evil genie, well, they were scattered into the wind. And then, weeks later, when the throne room had been repaired, and the king had been to all the doctors and wise men of his kingdom to repair his face, which was horribly burned, I met with that king in that throne room. And he spoke to me, and he said, "Young man, since you arrived in this kingdom, I have seen nothing but trouble. Nothing but trouble. Look at my face. I am horribly disfigured. And my dear daughter has died defending me and you and this whole kingdom. She died fighting that genie, the genie who transformed you into a gorilla. So you have been liberated, but we are left a scarred and broken place. Now I harbor no great ill will towards you, but I want you to leave and go somewhere else and live your life somewhere else. And if you ever return to this kingdom, I will have you killed." And I said, "I am sorry, your majesty, for all the misfortune I have brought into your kingdom. I will leave, and I will not come back." So I left that throne room. I left that palace. And so I put on the black woolen robes of a Sufi dervish, and I began to sing and chant poetry all day long, and recite prayers from morning to night, and even in my sleep. And I wandered over this earth from this land to that land for months. For years I wandered, as the river of time moved down through the days and months of this world into the great eternity, which is the great sparkling ocean in which all things begin and in which all things will end. And then one day I found my way to this marvelous city of Baghdad. And then one night I wandered down a road, and I came to your door, and I heard the laughter and the singing behind this door, and I knocked on that door. And the rest of my story you know. Well, everyone was amazed to hear the story of the one-eyed Sufi dervish, and no one was more amazed than Harun al-Rashid, the caliph. And the woman of the house, she spoke and said, "Thank you, good sir, for your story. Thank you for your story." And so the caliph and Jafar and the three ladies of that house and the musicians and all the others in that room passed the night in splendor and happiness, laughing and singing and telling their stories till late in the night. And then the caliph, Harun al-Rashid, and Jafar went back home. They walked through the streets of Baghdad until they came to a secret door in the back of an alley, an orange door. And they opened that door and walked down a long hallway that went this way and that way, labyrinthine, that winded this way and that, like the movements of a snake. And finally they came back, by a circuitous route, to their palace. And they entered that palace, and Harun al-Rashid, the caliph, who had been so restless before, lay down to sleep. And he slept well through the long night, and did not awake until the birds were singing their first songs in the trees. And it was at this point that Scheherazade stopped speaking, for golden light was coming through the windows of the royal bedroom. The day had begun. "Oh, my sister," said Dunyazad, "what a marvelous and amazing story." "Yes," said Scheherazade, "and if the king lets me live for another day, I will tell you another story that will be even more amazing." "We'll see," said the king, as he always did. But in his heart he said to himself, "I have to let her live another day, just so I can hear another one of her amazing stories." So all three of them slept a bit more, and then they arose to greet the day. And as before, they found that these stories followed them, that they lived inside them. They were like seeds caught on a piece of clothing after you walk through a forest. They were like bells they heard far off that they could not forget ever hearing. So that Dunyazad, as she walked through the palace garden, she remembered that poor man as a gorilla weeping on the top of that mountain. And Scheherazade, as she stood in one of the towers of that castle and looked out at the wide view and saw the setting sun going down far away across the sea, well, she remembered the king's daughter spreading red sand on the floor of the throne room. And the king himself, when he was in a meeting with his ministers discussing battle plans of this or of that kind, he found himself not thinking about the battle plans, but about that hairy gorilla who found his way to freedom by seizing hold of a quill and writing on parchment the words of a poem about compassion and true love.